Welcome and thank you for tuning in to the 412 Double Play podcast. As the 2023 season is over, Texas Rangers are World Series champions, and we are off to the offseason. I am, as always, your host, Michael Castrogano, jumping on today as my Double Play partner, fellow writer for Inside the Bucs Basement, and host of Locked On Pirates. You probably recognize his face before mine, Ethan Smith. Glad to have you on today, man. How you doing?
Doing all right, dude. Getting some of that Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania weather down here in Savannah the last couple of days, so it feels kind of nice seeing everybody all bundled up down here, not knowing what to do.
Yeah, I don't feel too bad for you. We've been having that kind of weather for a while. So we've got a lot to talk about. Now, we're recording this on Friday, and the obvious topics for us, roster moves, off-season hits, Tucupita Marcano claim waivers by the Padres, Alfonso Rivas by the Guardians, Vinny Capra by the Brewers, Cody Bolton was sent to Seattle for cash considerations. We also heard late last night that Angel Perdomo, who ended the year on the 60-day injured list, Miguel Andujar and Yuri De Los Santos have all been placed on waivers, not claimed, not traded as of now. Certainly can change by the time this episode actually drops, but for you personally, do any of these moves surprise you, or do they move the needle one way or another for the Pirates?
I would start with the Marcano trade or waiver pickup, just because it surprised me because Ben Cherington did so much to go get that guy. We always remember that in the Joe Musgrove trade, he wanted Tucupita Marcano in that trade and couldn't do it. And then obviously made the other trade with the San Diego Padres to get him, sending Adam Frazier. And I know he had the injury that sidelined him. It's going to sideline him to the point where he might not even play next year. You have a clog in that middle infield. We all know that. Anybody that listens to your show or my show knows that at this point. And I think it gets to the point with the Marcano stuff is I think that's just step one of figuring all this out. And Cody Bolton surprised me a little bit too, because a lot of people, including the Pirates, were high on him for so long. And to see him just get traded for cash considerations to Seattle kind of surprised me. But ultimately, I think this is just a clear indication with these moves to start the offseason that now with only 35 people on the 40-man roster, if Andujar and Perdomo get acquired by somebody, which I'd imagine they probably will, it's clear that the Pirates are going to add a little more this year, Michael, than they were accustomed to, and they're not going to subtract as much as we're accustomed to either.
Yeah, Perdomo for me was the big concern. Now, we haven't heard any updates about his elbow and how serious that is, but with Rivas, him getting released so early into the offseason seems to be a clear indicator that they're going to target a first baseman, potentially a left-handed one. Andujar, it doesn't seem like he's going to be in the picture for that if he's already being waived. Do you foresee this being a Connor Joe Jared Triolo situation, a reunion with Carlos Santana, or do you want them to target someone else either via free agency or trade?
So I think it's interesting that you look up and down about first base and what's available. And obviously the name that comes to a lot of people's minds is Rhys Hoskins. But I do think it's kind of hard to really evaluate what you're going to be getting from that guy, considering he didn't play at all this year. And ultimately, he's a right-handed power bat, which I think in PNC Park, you want it to be a left-handed power bat just because I think it plays a little bit better. So then but you look up and down the board. You look at CJ Cron, Rhys Hoskins, Max Muncy is a possibility. I mean, you mentioned Carlos Santana already. Brandon Belt is another name too. I just don't think they want to go into next season again with Connor Joe and Jared Triolo as the guys. Now, if Jared Triolo, if they're confident enough that he can continue to play like he did this past season, yeah, sure, do it. You're going to have great defense over there, but he is more of a singles doubles guy, and I think the Pirates are really looking for that elite power at first base that they've really been longing for quite some time. I'd even argue as long as Pedro Alvarez at this point. And you had Josh Bell, who's also a free agent too, but Josh Bell's also obviously not going to give you the defense that you want over there. So it's really hard to gauge that, I think, but there are options available if the Pirates do want to get them at first base.
Yeah, they definitely haven't had a power first baseman in a number of years. I will say Max Muncy, it was announced late last night that the Dodgers signed him to, I think, a 2-year deal, 2 or 3 years. So he's off the market. There's not really a lot of first base options. And the Pirates kind of need some power in that lineup, some pop, certainly from that first base position. Silver Slugger nominations came out this past week. Unsurprisingly, 0 Pirates were there. It's unlikely that any Pirates players are in contention for any awards outside of Key hopefully getting a gold, potentially platinum glove. I'll talk about that next week, hopefully after it happens. But I've got my Key shirt on. But with the season finally ended, Texas clinching its first ever title, Bruce Bochy getting his 4th, with a team that's created through a mix of homegrown talent, but also a lot of high dollar free agents and savvy trades. Is this win by Texas a change of pace since we are having a first time champion with the Rangers? Or is it still status quo given that they had the 4th highest payroll in baseball this year?
So I strip the name Texas Rangers away from this, and that's where usually my argument comes in is don't look at the team name, don't look at anything about like the Texas Rangers. They won it, but look at the players that they had to go out and get in free agency to really make this happen. You look at Corey Seager, who won his 2nd World Series MVP this year. You look at Marcus Semien, who was a major component to all this. Adolis Garcia, I consider him a homegrown talent just because he never really played for the Cardinals anyway. So I'll give him credit there. But as you mentioned, it was a good mixture. You have Josh Young, you have Evan Carter, you have Adolis Garcia, you have all these other guys that really did impact it. But you also can't kid yourself and act like it wasn't thanks to Nathan Eovaldi, Corey Seager, Marcus Semien, all these other guys that they go out and get in the offseason. Also via trade, they go get Jordan Montgomery, Aroldis Chapman. They shore up that bullpen. And I said it before the playoffs even started, Michael. I said that bullpen can just be good for a month, that the Rangers were going to win the World Series. And that's all they did. They were good for a month. And then they didn't lose a road game the entire playoff run. But I would lean more status quo just based off of the fact that a lot of people also forget they did this without Jacob deGrom too, folks, and they gave him a lot of money as well. And you obviously bring in Max Scherzer too. It's really, I want to say it's not status quo just because it is the first time they did it. And I think it was desperation on their part that it was now or never for them with all the money that they've been spending. But I'm also not going to say money is everything, considering look at the teams with the top payrolls this year that didn't make the playoffs. It really still boils down to what can you grow within your system so that you don't have to go out and go grab all these guys out of free agency.
Definitely helps to have those deep pockets, and it doesn't seem like the Pirates will be spending nearly to that extent. On the Pitching In podcast recently, Jason Mackey, Mike McHenry, they had Dan Sangrilli on from 93.7 The Fan, and he indicated that he expects the Pirates to spend upwards of $50 million or maybe more this offseason. Would that surprise you, or is that an expected value in order to get this team into contention for 2024?
So the $50 million thing, I talked about this on my show on Tuesday about trick or treat. Don't be tricked into the money figures that you see and treated to like, oh, okay, this is a great signing already, because ultimately, folks, we don't know what's going on in Ben Cherington's head. Me and Michael have never probably spoken to the guy. You might have. I don't know. I've never spoken to the guy, but we don't know what he's doing. We don't know what he's going to want. We don't know what direction he's going to take all this. But I would say in the realm of $50 million is probably where you are comfortable thinking about that, because you're looking at annual expected values. You know, Kutch is going to be a part of that too. So he's going to get like some arbitrary number that's going to inflate that number just a little bit. But when you're also expecting them to go out and get 2 starting pitchers, starters aren't cheap. They just aren't. We saw them sign Rich Hill last year to $8 million and Vince Velasquez to about 4.5. You're already at 12.5 at that point. Then you go get a first baseman. That's not going to be cheap either. So you're probably already talking about 18 to 19. So 50 might be a little high, but I also wouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised if Ben Cherington did get into the 50, even $60 million range. And I've also flirted with the idea that they might extend Mitch Keller this offseason too, Michael, and I would even factor that into some spending in the offseason that they do internally.
It definitely seems like there's a high probability that Keller gets extended. The 50 million, I think, is with the assumption that they're going to hopefully sign one of those starting pitchers to a multi-year deal.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see if that happens. And I'll get back to that in a second, but I wanted to mention how we have talked on for a while on Twitter or X, however you want to call it, working together for Inside the Bucs Basement. Haven't talked much about your podcast work because despite being probably the youngest among all of us, and I've had Craig on, I've had Gary on, Jim, we've all got some gray in our beard. You're still, as much as you joke about it on your show, just turned 25, one of the more tenured podcasters, in spite of that, having started with your show back in, I want to say 2020. So can you just talk about your journey that led up to your role with the Locked On Network?
Well, what's always funny about this, and I still joke with so we changed channel managers recently to where the host of Locked On Reds, Jeff Carr, that's his whole thing. Great guy, does amazing stuff for the network. But I get a random text message on Twitter way back when from Sean Woodley over at Locked On Raptors, who does a phenomenal job over there as well. And I honestly thought it was like a spam message. I was like, why am I getting this like message that's like this long in my DMs about hosting some show for the Pittsburgh Pirates? And I submit obviously like a little show for it, like a sample show. They loved it, and the rest is history. Obviously, Gary has been a big part of a lot of the growth that I've had. And ultimately, one of the things that I thought was so funny about it, Michael, when I started doing it, it's like, oh, I could talk about baseball easy. Then I realized how hard it is sometimes to talk about baseball. And you really learn so much. Like, I never really understood arbitration. Now I understand it like the back of my own hand. I never really understood the Rule 5 draft. Now I understand it completely. I understand how the MLB draft process works with player pools and why the best guy doesn't always get drafted number one overall because they want to spread this money across like the entire draft period. And you look at the teams that I've had the pleasure of doing this for. 2020 I was in after that season. So my greeting was bye Josh Bell, bye Joe Musgrove, bye Jameson Taillon. And now I'm scrambling. I don't even know how to talk about prospects yet at all. So I'm scrambling to talk about Jack Sawinski and all these other guys that we picked up. And then 2021 comes and I'm excited to talk about Ke'Bryan Hayes. Loved him, loved everything about him. And he breaks his wrist on the second day of the season against the Cubs. Yep. And then, of course, 2022 comes, and I'm like, okay, we're doing okay now. Like, we're getting things going. You had the whole Brian Reynolds saga where we all thought he was going to be traded and all that stuff. That was very fun to try to tell people, hey, he's not going anywhere. I only said it for 2.5 years, Michael. I didn't know how many times I needed to say it anymore. But then 2023 last year, I think through this entire season covering it, which I obviously had some other circumstances that didn't let me fully ingrain myself in it. But even the 20-8 start was the best thing that's happened to my show ever since I started. I mean, people were just eating that stuff alive. Then obviously we trailed back to the mean a little bit. And I think the best thing about right now, where we currently sit on November 3rd, is there's a different feeling about this Pirates team that I don't think we felt really since 2018, where 2018 kind of felt like, okay, it didn't work out in 2013 through 2015, but they kind of took that little break. They moved on from McCutchen, obviously, but then things still kind of like trailed in the right direction, at least a little bit. But now when you look at this roster, there's guys that when people interact with us on Twitter or interact with us on our articles on Inside the Bucs Basement and stuff like that, it's actually nice because these people know these players. For the last 2 or 3 years, it's hard because, I mean, talking about Josh Van Meter like he's going to be here forever is just ludicrous. He's not. And now you're looking at guys like Henry Davis, Endy Rodriguez, and Brian Reynolds and Ke'Bryan Hayes are extended for the next 7 years, where you can actually look at these guys and evaluate them. And it's fun as a podcaster, and I'm sure you get this too. You feel like you're almost growing with the team in a way, because you look back on episodes. I do this all the time. I look back on episodes like 2 years ago, and I'm like, who's the Pirates center fielder going to be? And that was like after the 2021 offseason. Lo and behold, apparently it's Jack Sawinski, and I didn't even think about that. And then I was talking about Clay Holmes being a potential big guy in this bullpen and being the Robin to David Bednar's Batman at some point. Obviously, he's not here anymore. So I think it really,
Yep.
podcasting boils down a lot to just talking to your audience like they're people, and also allowing them to share like everything they think, because ultimately Locked On Pirates is for them. It's not for me. It's for them. It's a medium for me to share stuff with you, just like Michael does here. But ultimately, these podcasts are for listeners. They are not for the people that sit here and talk for 30 minutes. We're just giving you guys a medium pretty much to express your opinions and your reactions and your thoughts to things. And I think that's what I've learned so much about it.
Yeah. I've been doing it since the start of the 22 season. So you've got at least one season on me. I will say that there is a taboo on saying the dreaded JVM name. So shall not repeat that name on this show. But yeah, it's a more fun atmosphere. It's always more fun when your team's winning, but even with having another losing season, it feels at least that the team's moving in the right direction. And they did this without, 3/5 of a real rotation by the end of the season. They did this without a potential 40-40 O'Neal Cruz being healthy after we lost him in the second week. So they definitely made strides overall, improved by 14 games in their record from 2022. But what for you is the most striking takeaway coming out of this fifth straight losing season, fourth straight under Charrington?
I think, honestly, you hit it pretty hard on the head with the fact that you really only had two starting pitchers for most of the second half of the year. You didn't have your best player in O'Neal Cruz. You had all kinds of other issues that were going on injury wise. You were trying out all these new players, all that stuff. And you still managed to be 14 games better than you were the year before. And I mean, you look at O'Neal Cruz, he was projected to be a 3.0 WAR player. Just add that to that, then you're 79 and 82. And like, you got to think, what if Vince Velasquez doesn't get hurt? What if JT Brubaker doesn't get hurt? One of my favorite prospects in the entire system, Mike Burrows, what if he doesn't go down and gets an opportunity to showcase what he can do? And despite all of this, they still won 76 games. I think that's my takeaway from it, is obviously nothing is going to be cookie cutter perfect throughout an entire season. The Rangers won the World Series and almost didn't make the playoffs on the last day of the year. Just always add that. Nothing ever goes well through an entire MLB season perfectly. It just doesn't. And for the Pirates, I think adding to the adversity that they were dealing with this year, and these young guys like Peguero and company really stepping up and making an impact and getting valuable experience without a lot of pressure, just because, again, we weren't a playoff team, so they were able to go out and get this experience without a lot of pressure. I think that's my biggest takeaway, is I feel like the experience that a lot of these guys got this year is going to be very valuable next season, especially if they can make the right moves in free agency, make the right moves in acquiring players, and hopefully stay relatively healthy.
Now, kind of jumping off of that, it's been mentioned ad nauseum how the Pirates should strive to be successful in the way that low payroll teams are having success. Baltimore Orioles, Tampa Bay Rays, Diamondbacks having made the World Series. But although two of those teams have made it to the final dance, none have been able to walk away with rings. So, given 2024 coming up, what would you feel is a successful final result for the Pirates entering year 5 of this rebuild? Would you be happy with them making playoffs, just making it in as a wild card, even if they get swept in the first round? Is that considered a successful season because they make it to October? Or do they need to
finish?
Really hoping that does not happen. No, I'm just saying, or is that not really the goal? Because if they have a rotation that's competent and the hitting can be more consistent, the guy's getting healthy, the goal isn't just to make October, even though that would be a big step up from this season. Like, what do you think is the barometer of success for 24?
Well, one, you have to improve your win total. Like, I mean, you have to, but I don't think a lot of people would be exactly happy if they won one more game than they did this past year and went 77 and 85. So I think a lot of it's just going to boil down to how the National League ultimately looks. Because what are the Mets going to look like? What are the Padres going to look like? Teams that didn't perform this year, are they going to come back and be very good teams? I think we can all make an educated guess that Milwaukee has a lot of questions, but St. Louis is not going to be as bad as they were last year. Chicago is going to be a relatively good team. You look at Atlanta, you look at Philadelphia, you look at Miami. They have a lot of questions, but they could potentially be a pretty decent team. The Philadelphia Phillies, the Diamondbacks, the Dodgers. I mean, you look all over the National League, but there's no reason to say the Pirates can't at least compete for a playoff spot. And that's where I'll even throw a question back to you is say they go and win 84 games and miss the playoffs by one game. Is that a successful season in its own right just because of what we've watched for the last 4 years? Because I know that answer is going to be real different now than it would be on September 31st of 2024. It's tough.
It's definitely going to be trying if we get 84 wins, which qualified, what, 2-3 teams this year?
The Diamondbacks had 84 wins, yes.
Yeah. So with this extra wild card, it definitely opens it up. I think that it will be interesting, even if that does happen and we're able to compete down to the wire in the last week of the season. Having exciting baseball again is going to be nice. I'm hopeful that we're able to make it to the playoffs and then kind of see how we stand at that point, going up against teams number one and our number one, whether that's Keller or a potential free agent that we get this offseason or someone else internal. And now that we are heading into the offseason officially, I talked to Mackey last week about some players he would most like to realistically target. For you personally, who are some players available either via free agency or trade who you'd like to see in black and gold this spring?
So pitching, I think, is where it comes to the most fruition for me. I think that is where if you're going to spend the big bucks, that's where you need to go do it. Like if they're going to go a little bit out of their price range. And Eduardo Rodriguez speaks to me for some reason. I know he opted out of his $18 million deal. He has a estimated annual value of 20. So that's tough for me to say as a Pirates fan, but having him would be phenomenal. Ben Cherington has obviously shown a willingness to want to go have starting left-handed pitching, but I do think he wants it still, but he wants it more on a role of where it's not a Rich Hill where he's just going to trade him by the deadline or Jose Quintana or Tyler Anderson. I think he's genuinely looking for a guy that he can sign to a multi-year deal as a left-handed starter and really shore that up in that rotation. I think that starts with Eduardo Rodriguez. He's one of those guys that, again, he's going to get a lot of looks, but I also find it interesting, and we all remember he didn't want to go to the Dodgers. He stopped that trade from happening, which I find very interesting. So is he going to want to go to a big market team and go somewhere else? I think that's a really big question mark. And if the Pirates are genuinely interested, I said it on my show on Tuesday, if Ben Cherington is interested in somebody, he will find a way to make it work financially. That is just how this is going to work all off season. So you look at him, and then you scroll down a little bit more. Lucas Giolito would be another guy I wouldn't be mad at. Wouldn't be mad at all. Aaron Nola is another guy that I just think is out of their price range, but would be absolutely tremendous to have in that rotation. Andrew Heaney from Texas, I think, is an interesting one. I do think he did opt into his player option, though, which didn't surprise me considering it was $13 million. And then trades-wise, it's just really hard to know how teams are going to attack the offseason via trade. But the show I actually did at Locked On Pirates on Friday opened my eyes up to it a little bit. Reed Detmers would be a phenomenal trade candidate for this team. The Angels, obviously, with Shohei Ohtani potentially leaving and Mike Trout, who knows what's going on with that. Detmers has like 4 years of team control. He's a lefty. He's relatively younger. Shores up that position for you. I think that works great for them. And then as far as other things go, I mean, Jorge Polanco is a guy that I really like on this team. I know a lot of us like the second baseman, like Liover Peguero and those guys. I would love a Jorge Polanco to kind of be that shortstop, second baseman kind of guy for them.
I think the Twins picked up his option.
I have not. I got to catch up on all this, Michael. It's so much news. But even
It's so
Gleyber
much.
Torres is a guy in New York. Is he happy in New York? Does New York want to move on from him? I'd be okay with Gleyber Torres. And then, I mean, you keep looking up and down the list, and you can look at all these people all you want. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we don't know who he is going to want. And apparently, all the people I want are picking up their options. So I'm just not going to mention it anymore. The one I did see today that I definitely know that also wouldn't be bad for him either is Whit Merrifield. I would love Whit Merrifield on this team with his consistency. He is a unrestricted free agent now. He declined his option, so he is an unrestricted free agent, and I'm very excited for that.
That would definitely be a veteran presence. It would fill a position at second base, although then it would kind of limit opportunities for the younger players like Nick Gonzalez, Leo Peguero, Jared Triolo would kind of be limited to first base and splitting the role. And Merrifield being is he right-handed or?
He is a right-handed hitter.
Okay.
It could be.
I didn't know if he was a switch hitter off the top of my head, but isn't quite the player he used to be in Kansas City. I'm not opposed to it. I feel like he could perform better. He's been in Toronto, getting off the turf would probably help his knees, given that he's 34, going in 35, something like that.
34 going on 35.
Yeah, so mixed on that. I really like Eduardo Rodriguez. Going back to your point about him declining the option to the trade to the Dodgers, it seems like he's going to be more happy staying in kind of a small city, small market role, kind of in that Zach Greinke mentality where he'd fare better there. So it's just a matter of whether or not they can find a deal that works for him. But I think he would excel in Pittsburgh. So hopefully we're going to be talking soon about some exciting free agent signings, some exciting trades. But the special this week that I'm going to be talking about is regression for 2024. And while that can be a scary word, predicting future performance is predicated on analyzing existing production against averages. And regression isn't always a bad thing. Players regressing to the mean could mean a drop in production if they are overperforming their advanced metrics, but also improving numbers if they've suffered from some extreme bad luck. So I'm going to go through each of these players, and I just want to get your feedback on if you agree, disagree, or are indifferent on that. So I've got two guys who I think will do better next year, two guys who I think will do worse. First one, I'm going to talk about Kyle Nicolas. We only got a small sample size for Nicolas in Pittsburgh this year, 4 games, 5.1 innings, and an 11.81 ERA, almost entirely due to his first outing against the Cubs, 0.1 innings, 3 hits, 2 walks, and 6 runs allowed. Now, he was a pretty highly valued prospect coming up, was a starter for a few years, transitioned to the bullpen role this past season. We saw that work well for Carmen Mlodzinski. He now looks like a late innings reliever. Nicolas excelled at Indy after the transition, 3.67 ERA as a reliever. Opponents held to a 175 batting average. With Pittsburgh, small sample size, opponents BABIP of 462, wholly unsustainable across a full season, and his strand rate of 47.2%. League average is about 70%. Would expect that to regress to the mean and would anticipate him being better with a potential for either a multi-innings role or even like a 6th or 7th inning slot for him. What are your thoughts on Nicolas and whether he can bounce back from a rough first showing in Pittsburgh?
Well, and you look at it and you mentioned the small sample size. And for a guy like Kyle Nicolas, I think it all just really boils down to can he figure out his off-speed pitches? I'm not worried about his fastball at all. I don't think many people are really worried too much about his fastball all that much. But I would say, obviously, I think this one's pretty clear that he's not going to be like that kind of player again. He was very good in AAA. He was very good throughout the minor league system. I mean, when you only get 5.1 innings of work, your ERA, if you even give up 1 run, your ERA is probably going to be pretty bad. I mean, and then you're talking about giving up 6 or 7 in your debut. But again, you're looking at a guy that is born in 1999, so that makes him 24 years old. I mean, I just don't find it any way that he's that bad, especially with the stuff that he's will possess. Now, it depends on what kind of role he does get. I will say that'll mean a lot too, but I would expect him to probably start the season in AAA so that they can figure out that role for him and then just kind of slowly ingrain him onto the roster, but I would definitely say he'll regress positively.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to him going back to AAA. I think he started 23 in Altoona and then got maybe a mid-season bump up to Indianapolis. But another pitcher who I've got a little bit longer track record in Pittsburgh, and I expect to regress positively, and this is probably going to get me some bad feedback, Colin Selby. So Selby, of course, added to the 40-man ahead of the Rule 5 in 2022. Upper 90s velo, looked like the late innings bearded wonder. Started the year at Indy, fair all right. A little inconsistent with his outings, 3.86 ERA over 30.1 innings. Like you said, with a reliever role, you have one bad outing. It can really impact your overall numbers. But he got blown up in Pittsburgh, allowing runs in 10 of his 21 appearances, an even 9 ERA on the year. But like Nicholas, his advanced numbers are kind of stretched. He had a home run to fly ball rate of 21.1%, which is double the league average of about 10.5. Opponent's BABIP also well above average at 385, despite a strong ground ball rate of 48.5%. And his XFIP, or expected fielding independent pitching, for people who are not advanced stat nerds like me, was the same as Southpaw Ryan Barucki. It's still not great, but it's definitely a step up from the stat line that we're seeing with him. Colin Selby, what are your thoughts on him and whether he is a part of this bullpen come opening day 24?
So Selby is a little bit obviously different from Nicholas, 2 years older, still a guy that you're probably expecting to grow a little bit. But again, with relievers, we see relievers pitch forever. And you mentioned some of those advanced stats. He is actually a pretty good pitcher in some of those advanced stats. He doesn't really allow too many things to go wrong for him. But again, smaller sample size, ERAs inflated. But in those 21 appearances, he gave up 4 home runs. I mean, that's something that he's obviously going to have to fix. You look at the other things as well with him. Very good strikeout to walk rate, which I always like, as you've probably listened to my show before. Strikeout to walk rate is like my thing with pitchers. 30 strikeouts to 15 walks. The opponent average was 296. You obviously want that to improve as well. I would say with the right role and the right situation for him, he can regress positively, especially if he can keep that strikeout number high and that walk rate low and bring down the home runs. I think those are all viable things for him. Now, I don't think he'll be relied upon as much as he was this. Now I will say it was a small sample size, but he did still play 21 games. I don't think he's going to be relied upon as much as he was this year going into next because of acquisitions and whatever they decide to do. But I would expect Selby to at least improve.
Yeah. So kind of taking a pause on the regression stuff. An international prospect who is kind of overshadowed because there's bigger names out there. And I was trying to get the name pulled up. I think it's Shingo Inaga. As an American, I just apologize for how poorly I am at all this. But he has I think a 30% strikeout rate or near that in the Nippon Professional Baseball League and a walk rate of around 3%. And he's obviously not the top Japanese pitcher on the market, but is that someone that I don't know if you've even read about him, but someone that potentially the Pirates could swoop in while all the big market teams are trying to get the top guy and just nail the second, I don't want to say second tier because he's still a very good pitcher, given that they haven't really targeted any international players at the professional level. Obviously, gotten a lot in the minors for the international signings, but is that someone that you could see them targeting overall?
Possibly. It's just, again, you mentioned that most people are going to be going over after Yoshinobu Yamamoto. That's just how it's going to be.
Yep.
And I feel like a team will panic buy on the other guy. I just really do. I think it'll be something when Yoshi signs and then another team is like, well, we still want a good Japanese starting pitcher. It's like, okay, well, this guy's here. We're going to pay him a little bit less and call it a day. So, I mean, it's a possibility. But as you mentioned, the Pirates haven't really done that in quite a while. Jung Ho Gong comes to mind. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
last time that I can really remember that they really went out and got a top tier Japanese baseball player or a Korean baseball player. So, I mean, it's good. It's kind of tough for me to think that they would really delve into that much, but you never know. I think that's the biggest thing for it, Michael, is that you never really know.
Yeah. The name Shoto, I don't know if this is how you pronounce it, but Shoto Iminaga. And he's a lefty, so I feel like that would be another reason to. And 30, which 30, I guess, maybe be older for a prospect, but someone that, if they go international, and obviously they're not going to go for Yamamoto, it would
Mm-hmm.
be interesting if they did go and target that. But that's all speculation. I have no inside information on that. Just something I thought about while you're talking about the strikeout to walk ratio. So pivoting to guys who I think will regress in a less positive fashion. Another one who I think probably will get me some harsh reaction from people, Jared Triolo. BABIP of 440, isolated power of .099, which is one of the lowest on the teams, if you exclude Austin Hedges. So he really relied on hits falling in for success. Barrel rate of 6% and average exit velocity of 86.6 are all in like the lower 10th percentile. His defense is great. Positional versatility definitely helps, but I just don't see him continuing the offensive numbers unless he's able to prove that he's got a little bit more power in the bat. So, what are your thoughts on JT and how he fits with the team, and whether that flash in September is a long-term viability for him?
Well, when you look at Triolo, and I think it's pretty easy to say that he's your utility guy going into next year. He could play any middle infield. He could play any infield spot. He could play first, second, shortstop, third, whatever you need him to do. Now, you mentioned the lack of power, and that's why I don't want him to play first base because they need power from that position. And yeah, I mean, some of his hits were fluky. Some of them were like little bloop singles that just so happened to fall. And I believe that he hit 299 on the average number, I believe was his numbers. Was that his final number for the year?
I
It was
think it was around
298.
there.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
298 over 181 at bats. Obviously, you expect him to probably have more than 181 at bats going into next year. And with that lack of power, I don't think he'll hit 298. And when you're saying like the regression of it, I do think that he'll probably drop down to like 260, maybe even 270. I think that OPS will come down from 786 to probably 720, 730. But you hear those numbers and say, well, he's regressing down. But if you have a utility guy who's hitting 270 and a 700 plus OPS, I think the Pirates still take that. I just don't think he'll do it on the same level that he was doing it, as you mentioned, in September.
And maybe he'll surprise us. I think that he did change his batting stance, was able to have more power from that, because his overall numbers were weighed down by a subpar first couple weeks. Subpar, he was still like hitting pretty well, but it was mostly singles. A lot of his, if not all of his extra base hits came in September after his second call up. But the second player who I think could regress negatively is Ryan Borucki. Obviously, strong season, 2.46 ERA, 0.74 whip in 40.1 innings. But the reason why I see him dropping is the same reason, except in the opposite direction, that I see Nicholas and Selby improving. Regressing to the mean, he gets soft contact, but that's the only consistent he has. 2.6% walk rate was a career low, and by a lot. I think his career walk rate is closer to 10%. Could have an issue with that bouncing back. Strikeout rate, 21.7%. It's respectable, but it's not something that is enough to maintain that kind of ERA long term. BABIP, 0.206. Strand rate of 81%. Likely over a longer stretch of innings will expose him a bit more and potentially have that ERA bounce up a little bit. I don't think that he's going to be poor long term. I just think, like you said, relief pitchers are fluky, and one bad game can inflate that ERA. And I think that he may be due to have a change to those numbers in 24. But your thoughts on Borucki? I mean, we picked him up as a minor league flyer earlier in mid-season 23. So for him to come up and post those kind of numbers was fantastic. But as far as sustainability long term, your thoughts on Barucki?
I mean, there's not much really. I don't think a lot of people even expected to get this production out of him anyway. And you look at it and you say, okay, his numbers were good on the surface, but then you go to the advanced numbers and they're not as good. Just another guy that also over a full season, can he do what he did in the time he was in Pittsburgh on the MLB roster over a full season? I don't think he can do that. And I will say and preface this that even though I agree with all of these players either regressing positively or negatively, just because they regress negatively doesn't mean that they're still not a good player. Shohei Ohtani could regress negatively next year and still be the best player in baseball. It's just how that kind of works. It's more of regressing back to the mean in terms of, do we really think Ryan Barucki is going to have a 2.46 ERA over a 162 game season? Probably not. But he could still be a 3.3 ERA guy out of the bullpen. And a lot of people would still look at that and say, oh, he's still a pretty good left-handed relief option. So that's where I leave that pretty much on Barucki. Is I think he'll be 3.3, 3.4 ERA, but still be a very valuable option out of the bullpen for them, especially as a lefty.
Yeah, I think that we would all take that from half of our left-handed relieving core. Seems like with Perdomo gone, Jose Hernandez or potentially someone else, if they decide to send Hernandez down to AAA, will be the other half of that. But we've gone on long enough, so that wraps it up for all of us here at the 412 Double Play Podcast. Thank you, Ethan, for joining me today. If you're listening here, you're likely already tuned into Ethan's podcast. But if not, check out Locked On Pirates, part of the Locked On Network, on all podcast outlets. Find them on Twitter. If you're watching on YouTube, you see at MVP Ethan or at Locked On Pirates. You can follow me on Twitter at 412 Double Play. Continue listening to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever else podcasts are found. From all of us here at the 412 Double Play Podcast, thank you for joining us, and let's go Bucs.